Okay, let's move to session number 2. And in session number 2 is where we're going to begin talking about all of the drivers. Remember, upfront cost, operation cost, resources, all the financing costs, and everything else to put the LCOE together. Now, in this session, we'll talk about the components of the upfront cost, some mysteries around the upfront cost. This is clearly what's caused the real revolution. Okay, and we'll also talk about the operating cost. So I'm going to go through some detailed discussion about how to actually get the cost of solar modules, how we can then look at all the other items other than the modules. We have to get inverters, we have to put the racking systems in place, we have to get the tracking, we have to get the bifacial. We don't have to, but we could get tracking and bifacial and put some wiring and labor. And we'll see why is the cost so different in different regions of the world. Is it labor cost? Can it really be that much difference? When we go through the capital costs, we're going to start talking about a couple of these complications that I introduced in the last session on the LCOE. Okay, and then we'll move to operation and maintenance costs and see again there's some pretty dramatic differences you can find in different places and try to understand just a little bit why they are. Some are obvious, like the cost of land, but some are also almost as obvious, like the cost of perhaps some other taxes you might pay, but then there's some other surprising differences. And we'll talk about both in the context of the capital cost and the operating cost, how to make this adjustment with the levelized cost and how to do some computations of real cost and levelized cost. Let's talk about the manufacturing history. Let's talk about a solar manufacturer. Now, there are stories and stories of bankruptcies. I think I better get this right. Edison, famous bankruptcy. Everybody, you got into the solar business, and at one time you were considered. I put this little kind of slide from one of these consultants, and in corporate finance, there's kind of a basic idea. You want to make a return that's higher than your cost of capital. And you measure the return with return on invested capital and the cost with the weighted average cost of capital. So if you're an engineer looking at this, well, this is the returns and the benefits. And if you have something good, you want to grow it. And at first, solar manufacturing, it's a brand new technology. You were making high returns back in the German feed-in tariff days. And then the industry was growing fast and it was earning high returns, and you were way up here. And suddenly, people realized, and that's why we introduced in the first session a little bit what it takes to make solar power. You take some sand, you heat it up and refine it to some silicon, you cut it and do some other stuff. I'm not saying it's that simple, but it's not something where, you're going to be able to differentiate yourself or get somebody addicted to you like a Disney thing or Coca-Cola or something where people can make you dependent on their projects. It became a commodity. And it left a miserable trail of bankruptcies for companies with high labor costs and high other costs. Okay, and what happened is these companies with high growth, they might have still be growing, but they were earning less return than their cost of capital, and it doesn't take long to go bankrupt, and that's kind of the worst place to be in corporate finance. You can call them yourself cash cows, still making a return but not growing, still making a negative return but being smart enough to get out of the business. This is the worst place to be, and that's where you ended up. Okay, now when we talk about the capital cost, if you're talking about real estate, you measure the real estate per square meter, I think. Okay, if you're talking about a road, you measure how much does it cost per square mile, or a transmission line, or a pipeline. If it's an oil, how much does it cost per barrel? Okay, there are benchmarks. We need some benchmark to cover the cost. In other electricity plants, you measure the benchmark as the cost divided by the maximum you can possibly produce. Well, in solar, that maximum you can produce is a little bit iffy, because if you have more sunlight, you produce more. So what they come up with is something called standard testing conditions. And when you have a solar panel, you put a beam of light on this, and that beam of light has 1,000 watts per meter squared. And that test is conducted at 25 degrees centigrade. And down here you can see STC, 1,000 watts per meter squared, 25 degrees cell temperature, and some other humidity and other things. And that's how you define, that's what we use. Now I'm, this 1,000 watts per meter squared is not just some arbitrary number. What you can do, and what I find so absolutely intriguing, is you can go to a website and download hour by hour solar irradiation per meter squared in different areas. You Google map it. We are going to do that. Now, I've done this for, I think this is probably Paris. And this is probably June. And there are some hours where you actually get more than your capacity. You get more. But that, you can see that 1,000 kind of number is the high point, the typical kind of high point. Not exact, of course. It's not like when you have a car and you press the accelerator all the way down to the floor and you can see the maximum speed. Or you run a refinery at absolutely full capacity and see how much petrol you can produce. Okay, it's not exactly like this. It depends, the solar output. If you could get some mythical place where you get 2,000, maybe on a different planet, maybe on Venus. Venus. You'd get more. Maybe you'd get a lot more sunlight per meter squared. But it seems on Earth that 1,000 is a reasonable benchmark. Here's in Nigeria. Look at the difference. We're going to talk about this, digressing and going forward a little bit. This uncertainty around the solar. This is kind of in the northern desert in Nigeria. You've got such flatter kind of patterns. Getting this data is so exciting. Speaking of getting data, now let's go to getting the data for for the panel costs. Now, somebody years ago, and this is really how lucky I am, I get told these kind of things. Somebody said, well, look, you just go to this website called pvinsights.com, and I did this, and somebody gave it to me probably where's the date, about 2014 or something. And in 2014, they give you the cost of a module. They gave you the silicon module and a thin film module, and they gave you a high and low and average. And the cost for a module was $668. Now, I am so obsessed with this website. This is one of the tools. I have been collecting the data ever since on the cost of the modules. And every month I kind of try, sometime in the month, click on a little button and it goes and retrieves those costs. And where those costs were up here, they were around 600 when I started. They've come down to 200. These lines are the cost of a thin film is higher than the cost of a silicon, and they got all the way down to about 170, and then I've also graphed the cost of the silicon itself. And I hope you can see now, that's good that you showed us that you need some silicon to make this. This is around the pandemic, and maybe this will come down. Maybe this is kind of a temporary spike. There was a spike in this. This is the real story of solar power. Here, back in, oh no, back in the year, I need to make the scale a little larger, don't I? I think this was in the year 85 or something like that. The cost was 7,000 and it came down and down and down. 3,000. Ooh, pretty good. It's a pretty good decline. Then the price of silicon, like the price of just about everything, spiked in 2018. Then it came crashing right back down after the recession. And the panel cost has gone from 7,000 to about 200. Tell me something else. Maybe you could find something else, like it's actually computer chips or something that comes down like this. But this is dramatic, and this is really what's behind the solar power story. I'm sorry about the background noise. Now I'm going to just introduce a tool to you. Okay, and this tool is called it's a little file that's called PV Insights. Now, so you open this file called PV Insights, and then you see some data that I've graphed since February 15. And then you can see our long-term history chart, and you can see our chart since 2015, and you can see a few other charts. Okay, and some other polysilicon data and some miscellaneous stuff. And now let's say you want to update this. And right now I'm in July. And if I want to update this, I'm going to click Get PV Insights. And it's going to go to the PV Insights and plop the data in there. And then I've updated my database. And we're going to give you some more things to do. Okay, and then you go to the Format a New Read. Oh, please make it okay. And what it does is it puts the latest data in there. And we can see that the thin film has gone down a touch, and and it just grabs the data from the database. The average price has gone down a touch, and polysilicon is still very, very high, but it's updated. And that's how you can keep track of this highly important kind of data and understand a little bit what's happening to what happened to the revolution in solar panels. And that's, of course, come from China entering in the market. Now, unfortunately, we're not finished with this. We have a lot of other components. We have the modules, but we have an inverter, we have wiring, we have some other materials, we have racking. Here's a little picture of some of the other materials. These are the modules, and some strings, and some wires, and some inverters. The inverter converts the power from direct current to alternating current. Now, the big question for me is why, if people pay the same for a panel, this is a little bit old data, I'm sorry, but it's a nice kind of illustration about what happens. Why is the cost of 4 kW system, this is a rooftop, so you take the 20,000 divided by 4, that would be 5,000 per kilowatt in US, and you would take, I don't know, somewhere more than 1,000 in Germany. And here's the cost of the panel back then, and the cost of the panel was probably a lot more. It's about 1,000 or something. So why are these costs so different? The inverter cost, I find it a little bit tricky to get this inverter cost. The place I find, the best place to find real cost data is not to look up in Levelized, not to look up something I was just looking up, which we'll use, which is not that bad actually, and that's every 5 years, the International Energy Agency in Paris publishes kind of very detailed numbers and costs for all kind of different technologies. I'm sorry about this stupid noise in the background. Oh my God. Okay, and then where am I? Oh, here we are. Okay, so the cost of the inverter, it's tough to find this stuff, but I've seen recent studies where maybe it's 40 USD per kWp. Remember, the cost of the panel is about 200. And maybe it's up to 80 some things, okay? And if it's 40, it's 0.4 per watt. Or I should have put per watt peak. Here's some of the different suppliers. Then you can also maybe put a tracking system on your panels, and we'll talk about all of that and how that increases the resource and how to do an analysis of whether it's better to put tracking in or not. Perhaps on the equator you don't really want it because you're kind of flat there. But in South Africa, it would have a dramatic increase. And then we're going to talk about bifacial, which is putting these panels on both sides, kind of, so you get a reflection. And if it's sandy or snowy, you can get a lot more output. Maybe not 20%, but you can get more. And the cost is surprisingly little. 5 kWp, what McKinsey said was the real cost. And a lot of the producers seem to be offering all that. And it's affected here. I've got a little diagram that shows it's affected by how the reflection works. And then we have the costs in different countries. Why, if solar is such a commodity and the modules are the central part of it, why do you have, for example, the U.S. costing $1,500? This is a couple of years old, but it's still the same. I don't have. And India costing that much. I'm sure there's less labor, but I'm sure there are also a whole lot of profits you add in for the EPC contract, for the developer, for everybody else. And there's some marketing costs, and then we have another graph that shows you the dramatic difference in costs. Can kind of put a center on China sometimes on these kinds of costs, okay? And now I have a couple of examples from financial models. And this is a couple of years old. This is a Mexican project, and the cost of the panel was $295. That's why it's a couple of years old. And then you can see the cost of the inverter was about $80. That's pretty high, I think. And then you have the mounting cost and the transport cost, and I don't know what this is, and some installation costs. And finally, that panel cost becomes 700. And you can take, if we divide, let's divide the 300 by the 700. Okay, 300 divided by 700, we get about 42% as the panel cost. Now, I've heard numbers ranging from 35 to maybe something like that, depending on some other things. And here's another project in New York. Look at this. The cost per kWp, the first thing you should kind of compute in a model, in a model here, it was 1,700, and you ask why. Now, that's a couple of years old and all that, but still, here, I'm now using this thing I told you maybe not to use, this projected cost of generation. Now, they compute the cost, and they don't divide it by kWp, they divide it by the alternating current, which we'll see is generally a lot less. In fact, they say the alternating current you produce, the capacity you produce, if you have kWp, it's about 20% less, or 1.2. You divide it by 1.2. So in India, they're telling us currently the cost, on average for India, is something like 531 per kWp. 629 would be for kWp. AC. In Brazil, it's higher, 997. You wonder why the difference, okay? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take this cost and start converting it to a levelized cost. And I'm going to go through some of these issues on a step-by-step basis. Now, the thing we have to do is take those costs. I use the India and the Brazilian example, the 531 and the 937. Now, if you spread it out, you could divide it by the life. You could say let's use a 30-year life. If you divide 531 by the 30-year life, you get a lot lower than this. I'm not going to go and calculate it. Oh, why not? Okay, 531 divided by 30. And that gives you 17. And that you can call that something like a capacity payment. Now, the 17 is not right, because if we're spreading things out, we can't just spread it out without accounting for the fact that we're losing interest and we have to pay cost of capital. I better say cost of capital. So what we do is we take these costs and you go in Excel and you use a PMT function, and that's a levelizing function. And it levelizes it including the interest rate. And if you take the net present value of 38 over 30 years at 6%, you get 531. It's just a little bit of present value calculations that in the old days you'd have to open a little finance book and look at the back, and there'd be a little table with different discount rates and different lives, and they'd give you a PV factor. Okay? And that payment factor, actually, here is the payment factor. The C22 is the discount rate, year C23, payment just -1. That's like a payment, and that expresses it as an interest rate. The 6% interest rate becomes 7.26 because you got to recover the base costs and get your interest back. And that's the first step for levelizing something. Okay, now it's not that easy. One of the really important things to say is that when you're looking at levelizing a cost, should you compute a simple level amount and say this same number is today versus 30 years ago? If you think about what life was 30 years ago, that was in the 1980s for me. That's okay decade, I guess. No, I don't know. But that's a long time ago. Things did not cost the same today as 30 years ago. Maybe my salary hasn't gone up by that much, but whatever. Okay, and if there's a little bit of inflation, only 2% inflation, a 35 price cost is reduced to 28 by year 10, only by year 10, not even by year 30. And ultimately, when you're looking at a price of something, you go to the shop and buy something, and you're saying, should I buy a panel or should I buy something else that's going to last me 30 years? You want it, or 10 years or 5 years or whatever, you want to, or your electric bill, you're going to compare it. You have today's electric bill and you want to compare it to a relevant number today, and you want to add inflation probably. You can make little subtle arguments that there's some obsolescence you should care about as well. Now you can compute the real levelized costs by accounting for inflation. And what that does is it says, no, we're not going to use 35 today, we're going to use 31. And when you inflate 31 over 10 years, you're going to get exactly the same result. And here's an example. This depends on a discount rate. You take a 35 nominal amount, and then you can deflate it, and that's where it becomes 28. So that's just the nominal amount divided by the inflation factor. And then you can take the NPV at 0, which is just the addition. Okay, and then you can compute a real discount rate, which is 1. I should have shown the formula. It was 1 plus the nominal rate, 0, divided by 1 plus the inflation rate, 2, and you get 1.96. And then you put your PV factor using the real discount rate, not the nominal discount rate. This time you compute the present value. You don't do that. And then you can say, well, that my factor here is I can charge 89%, which is this divided by that. You use a nominal rate and then a real rate, and then you get the real price of 31, and then you prove that it works. You take the 31, inflate it, divide it, get the real price, and that averages out to 35, which is where you started. It starts at 31, goes to 38. That's how you can make adjustments. You use a couple of these NPV factors, and maybe I'm going through them too quickly. But we'll have a self-test, and you can mess around with this and say, I can get this. And I should be computing the real rate. And I put some of these formulas here so you can pause the video and see that. Now, if you use a 10% discount rate, the whole thing kind of is the same. You get a real discount rate, 1 plus 10% divided by 1 plus 2% minus 1. Get the NPV at the nominal rate of 10%. Get the NPV, the PV, rather the PV, using a minus 1 factor. This, you take the nominal divided by the real, and you get a factor for getting the first year price. You take that first year price and inflate it, and you divide it by the inflation rate, and you get the same real rate. That's a little bit of an introduction to some of the nuances of the LCOE. Now let's move to some operation and maintenance expenses. Here I've got little pictures of some of the things you have to do with a remote center. It looks all very sophisticated. That's just maintaining the plant, and you have to clean the panels, so that shows you a picture of before and after. But then the confusing thing here is that you have the base level of O&M to really operate and maintain the plant. But that typically does not include payment for a lease, that you're going to lease the land. Typically, you lease land. And you've got to pay for some insurance. That insurance might actually decline over time because the value of the plant ages, like I'm aging. I'm not worth as much as I was when I was younger, probably. You have to account for an inverter reserve if that's not already in O&M. You have to account for some, if you're in some places, in the U.S., for example, you have to account for some property taxes, and you might have to pay some accountants and some other people, not too much, I hope, but to kind of monitor the sunlight and all that stuff. So to find what the true operation and maintenance cost is, we've got the capital, and now we've got the operation and maintenance. In here are a couple of examples I found. It was 7 and 9 for the pure O&M, but by the time you added everything else, it was 19 and 22. And this KW year is now analogous to the KW year we computed for the capital cost. And basically we're adding these capital costs. Now 72 is a much bigger cost than the O&M, but the O&M, it can be a little bit significant. When I say something that I've said it in the earlier video, that solar is about the most capital intensive thing you can imagine, well, there's some real operation and maintenance. When you add all this other stuff, you get kind of a higher cost. And now to show you some real examples, this is so sad. They start with a base O&M per kilowatt peak per year, KWP maybe should have been. You find a model and you say, that started at 11. By the time you're finished, it got to 37. That's a pretty high cost. Now, I took this thing. Now it's really hard to find. I want you to be able to convert from megawatt hour to kilowatt year to megawatt year to kilowatt hour. And you just have to use kind of the 1,000 and 8760 or 8766 if you want the leap years. And so in this one, they said, here are the O&M costs. And they're going to these places and apparently really doing a big job in surveying people, asking what the costs are. And so I took the middle one, the 652, the 802, and the 369. These are the costs per kilowatt. Megawatt hour. And then they give you the capacity factor over here. And that means you can take the capacity factor times 8760, get the number of hours. And that's down here. And then if we want to convert these costs, now this 3% is related to the degradation that we'll get into in a minute. And that's over kind of the life, so you got to be a little careful here. You take that 652 per hour, multiply it by how many hours you do, and then you get per megawatt, not hour, per megawatt year. And that 652 times that's a pretty big number, but you want it per kilowatt year. That's what we've been using for our benchmark. So then you divide it by 1,000. So it's the cost times the hours, which is driven by the capacity factor, divided by 1,000. You should get used to, if you're getting into anything in electricity, you should get used to these kind of conversions. I've had friends who can kind of do all this immediately kind of in their head. I still can't. I still have to write it down and kind of take a minute to compute it. And now we've got a dramatically lower cost for India than Brazil, and we've got some reasonable cost numbers. Now, if you look at this famous Lazard thing, they don't tell you if it's nominal or real. They don't tell you kind of what discount and cost of capital they're using, and taxes are all. It's all kind of just a magic little potion that comes out at you. And what you want to do is here, they have an enormously high capacity factor, 34%. Whatever that means, that we'll come back to that. This is a high case, so a high cost case. And they put the O&M of 13 and 9, maybe okay, but I've shown you somewhere it's 37 and 22 and 19. So you got to be kind of careful and think about your costs and why your costs are going to be different than other costs. And here's another kind of thing from that the study, the IEA study that shows you that these costs are just all over the place. Now, when you're computing nominal and real costs, there are two adjustments to make. These are confusing, and we'll make these in all sorts of different things. And first of all, if you're taking today's costs, so we can go up to this. Let's say today's cost. Let's use India, 6.46. Okay, let's take today's costs. All right. But the LCOE on a nominal basis, our thing that we computed up here with 35 that just goes flat nominal, the O&M is always going to inflate. We need not today's value if we're going to compare it to nominal. We need to escalate it. And how do we make that adjustment? And the other thing we have to do is adjust for degradation. As you get less and less output from the project, it's almost like a negative inflation. It's almost like you're losing something and you've got to make up for it. You're selling less electricity if you want to do it in a simple basis. So we have two adjustments to make. And what you do is you first compute the real discount rate, like I said. This is to make this is when you're computing nominal LCOE and you're looking at the operation and maintenance, and you take 1 plus the nominal rate divided by 1 plus the inflation minus 1. And you get an inflation factor, PV of the real rate divided by PV of the nominal rate. And you just can take a factor of 1, and then you can say the nominal rate. So in our case, we would take the 6.46 and multiply it by a factor. But then we're not finished. We've also got to go the other way to adjust for degradation. And notice this time you minus, and the degradation is a percentage. Now, the banks and other people, they use different kind of degradation rates. And they say, oh, I'm going to do sensitivity analysis, and I don't know if these people who guarantee the degradation are full of crap, because if I have a guarantee that's going to be 30 years from now, will this guarantee actually work? And how do you measure how much degradation really occurred if you didn't clean the panels, for example, and you're getting a lower output? It's all a little confusing to get the guaranteed degradation, okay? We'll come back to that one as well, okay? But we do the same thing. We have an adjusted discount rate. You put 1 plus the degradation divided by 1 plus the discount rate divided by this. And you can use a nominal rate here and then get a degradation factor with exactly the same PV formula. And then you can multiply two factors, the inflation factor and the other factor, and get it. Now, if you're already in real terms and want the real discount rate, you just have to adjust for the degradation. It's getting a little confusing and it's getting a little nuanced, and that's to get the LCOE correct and not just say I'm going to just let Google Lazard and get the answer. To be able to do it yourself just a little bit, you have to understand these factors and go through a little bit. So the adjusted discount rate is 1 plus the real discount rate divided by 1 plus the degradation rate minus 1. You do the same PV factor, and this is the real. This should be real. Okay, I'm going to fix that. All right. Now we get the total cost, including the operating cost and the capital cost, and we get that either in nominal terms to compute a flat nominal LCOE or a real LCOE. And then you're pretty advanced. And then you can do a whole bunch of things with just a couple of those little formulas. And we're going to eventually prove how a financial model will give you the right result. And now that's the end of session number. This is session number 3. Okay, that's the end of our next session. So I'm stopping the video.